Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. Greg, Combine. It's upon us. The football season has barely ended, and we are full bore into the pre-draft evaluation process. Obviously, that's been the case with the All-Star games and everything that comes before, but
Yep.
Combine is always a real touch point for NFL teams and for people like us who will gather in Indianapolis next week to get to know these players more and to learn as much as we can from coaches and executives.
Yeah, no, Combine, I mean, I know you enjoy it. It's a great trip for me. Get to talk to a lot of people. No one is uptight. There's no game Sunday. It's just a great way to talk ball with a lot of different people. Um, see, for me, it's almost more of that. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I do get on the field, so I can see players up close and personal. And, certainly, let's say with quarterbacks, that's really helpful because I can actually stand there and see the ball come out of a guy's hand, which is a lot different than watching it on tape. Um, so it's another piece to the puzzle. And there are certain drills that do matter for different position coaches. But no, it's I really enjoy the combine every year. I'm looking forward to getting out there, and it should be a lot of fun. It always is.
Always, always, and not just about the opportunity for people like you. Obviously, you're more in the evaluation process and talking to coaches and general managers and various executives and scouts and things like that. For me, it's also a good opportunity to start seeing where the groundwork is being laid for free agency because
Oh
obviously
yeah.
that comes first and sets the table for what we'll talk about with the draft.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because free agency, and it's crazy because I'm so in the draft right now,
Yeah.
and this is a year where defensive players are there's a lot of them. I mean, this is a defensive tackle draft that I can't remember since I've been really doing it, going back, I don't know, 15 years now, where I've really been heavily involved in college evaluation. This D tackle draft is as good as I've seen, and boy, it takes a lot of time to watch defensive players, Buck. I keep telling people that you got to sit and watch full games. You could look at a stat sheet and see, and you know this from the Titans. I mean, you could look at a stat sheet and see Jeffrey Simmons has one tackle, then you watch the game and he dominated the game.
Right.
Defensive tackles are not about number of tackles necessarily. And you've got to sit and you got to watch 75, 80 plays. And for me, I watch 6, 7 games of these guys. I don't watch one game or two games. So it takes time. It's good time. I'm not complaining, believe me. I don't
Sure.
want people to think I'm complaining, but there's a lot of guys. And particularly when there's defensive guys, you got to just keep grinding through them. And that's the way I feel. Anyway, I feel most comfortable doing that.
Yeah, and to your point, Greg, I mean, there's a certain amount of time management skill that's required for these evaluation processes, and certainly you have to take into account, the various positions and how much time you're actually going to have to spend so that you can still get through the requisite amount of players to
Yep.
make sure that you're comfortable with the evaluation. Because, I mean, there's what, 300 draftable players, 250, 300
Yeah.
draftable
And I'm
players.
one guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to get through in detail. Sometimes I don't quite make it, but I try to get through 250 guys. I mean, it takes time. And uh, think about corners or safeties. See, sometimes you can go through a whole game and it doesn't seem like a safety does anything, particularly if he's playing on the back end. You got to
Yeah.
watch games. You got to sit there and just watch play after play after play after play.
So we understand how critical this particular time of year is for teams who are in the roster construction process. Everybody's in the roster construction
Yeah.
process, but certainly how critical this time of year is. Coming out of last season, though, Greg, to kind of set the table for all of these teams, I wonder before we start to talk about the combine and what you're looking for generally, coming out of last season, given that you study maybe not every team every week, because again, time
Right.
management wouldn't
Right. And,
allow
and
you
I'm
to do
one guy.
so.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I know that you watch enough throughout the course of the week and the preparation for the matchup show, and obviously your conversations everywhere else around the league in various markets. I wonder what kind of general themes you might have been able to identify from the 2024 season that kind of stuck out to you, maybe jumped out to you. You weren't necessarily expecting, but were
Right.
able to identify some things, be it tactically or otherwise.
You know, I'll tell you one thing that kind of jumped out to me, and it makes sense this year because it relates to the draft, Buck, is in some ways 2024 was the year of the running back. I mean, we had six backs with over 300 carries, whereas in 2023 we did not have any backs with over 300 carries. Um, and I just sensed watching the league this year that the run game became more important to teams. And I think there's reasons for that. We don't need to necessarily get into the weeds right now about all those reasons. But it's also a really good running back class this year in the draft. So I'm really curious to see if there's any change in philosophy or thought process. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's going to be five backs taken in the first round. That's not
Sure.
my point. But, with the way that teams on defense have really focused in recent years with trying to minimize big explosive pass plays, that has really become a foundation of what defenses do. The run game now for offenses has seemingly become a more meaningful part. Now, not every team, obviously, but even teams that we think of as really good passing teams, like the Detroit Lions. I mean, if Montgomery doesn't get hurt, they have two 1,000-yard rushers.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at what the Packers did with Josh Jacobs and how many carries he had. Who would have thought that Kyron Williams would have 316 rushes and he sat out the last game of the season? So it just seemed like the run game became a more viable part of the way coaches thought about running offense. And I'm really curious to see if that continues.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part, or at least that's one of the more interesting parts I assume about what it is somebody like you does, Greg, is I would imagine that you can't assign too much value to any one season, given the amount of turnover that takes place in the league each and every year, but you can still try and identify some things that may be foundational to
Right.
what teams are trying to accomplish schematically, offensively, or defensively that can further inform one, your analysis of players that are coming out and help inform how you view teams' needs on the personnel side of things.
Yeah, and this is a different question, by the way, than talking about, quote unquote, value of a running back or where running back should be drafted.
Correct.
We know that look, Kyron Williams was, if I'm not mistaken, a fourth or fifth round pick. I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden back should be drafted in the top 40, but run games, you can have really good run games without high draft pick backs. So I'm just curious to see how that goes. I think the other thing one of the other things that really stood out is um, I thought that the blitzing element in the NFL uh, is a big factor. I mean, and I don't know if that becomes a function, Buck, of the fact that with the collective bargaining agreement, you have less practice time, but being able to pick up blitz with your O line is so much a matter of cohesion and continuity and stability and working together. And I feel like that wasn't there for a lot of teams. And it's no knock on coaching, hey, you got to work within what you can do, but it just seemed like that the blitzing element to me was became more difficult for offenses this year. And I'm really curious to see how defenses continue to play. Some teams are really good getting their defensive backs involved in pressure schemes. They're so fast and they come from distance. The Chiefs, the Bucks, really good using their defensive backs. That just struck me as well, that pass protection. I had this conversation with some coaches who, said the same thing, that boy, it just seemed like pass protection was not at the level it needs to be. And again, you don't know every reason, but we know that with the collective bargaining agreement, you just don't have the same kind of time that you've had, years and years ago.
Yeah, it's a multitude of reasons, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
could talk about the quality of offensive linemen coming out of the draft process in any given year. You could talk about the practice time. Certainly, like you mentioned, there's always a variety of factors that play into larger themes like that. And I'm looking forward to talking to coaches about that this upcoming week. And I know you are as well, because you'll get a much better download on all
Oh,
the
for
different
sure.
information coming out of this particular combine week.
Yeah, no, that's the thing that I love having these conversations to kind of talk about the league and how they see things. The other thing that always fascinates me, and I'm always fascinated by the process of how coaches coach. I mean, it's funny. We went over this when we talked about the Super Bowl, but just watching the Super Bowl and seeing what Vic Fangio did, where he didn't rush five one time in the game. He basically lined up in a two high safety structure every single snap, even though there were some plays where he, had some post-snap movement, but for the most part, that's what he did. And so when I watch things like that, I think, God, I wish I could immediately call Vic Fangio and have him explain to me why he's doing that. And I did find out why eventually. But I love those kinds of conversations as to why teams philosophically think the way they do. Because that to me is, I'm a process guy, Buck. We've been doing this a long time. You know that about me. You know, hey, once we have access to the results, we all think we know the answers. But I love the whole process of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, the personnel evaluation process is always subject to change depending on the teams, the various situations, and Lord knows it's not a perfect science. For as many
No.
times as we've done this and talked about, the various buzzwords that sometimes prospects get labeled with, and like I mentioned, we'll go through free agency. The franchise tag window is open as of yesterday as well, so that will
When
be
does free agency officially begin?
March the 12th is when the new league year begins, according to my handy dandy
Okay.
NFL schedule of events. So we can expect that here in the not too distant future, Greg.
No, that's coming up, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the Titans do. I mean, obviously, it's a team with a lot of needs. We know that. As we speak today, they have the number one pick in the draft. I'm sure they'll get trade offers. That always happens.
Hmm.
The question is, how do they evaluate players in the draft? That it all starts with that, because if there's a guy you absolutely feel you have to have, you want to stay with your pick. If you feel you can get a really good player, at pick 8 as opposed to pick 1, then you may want to make a trade because this is a team. I think we would all agree. I don't think we're saying anything out of school here that has a good number of holes that need to be filled. It's not likely one player all of a sudden makes them a Super Bowl contender next year.
Right. And you and I, just for the purposes of the audience, this is not something that you and I typically get into as far as the contract stuff goes with players, but an interesting thing I think for Tennessee to watch because we did get the projected salary cap figures yesterday. It's expected to go up about $20 million dollars.
I mean, that's a big number.
It's a big number. And I wonder, I'm just so curious, Greg, and obviously we won't be able to answer this, how that impacts a team like the Titans that may have been waiting for, just as a hypothetical, the Saints, who desperately need cap relief. Derek Carr is an interesting
Right.
figure there. That's a player who Brian Callahan has connections with. I don't know whether the cap spike is going to help a team like the Titans because players will become available and you'll have more financial wiggle room if you're Tennessee under the cap. But it also gives teams the ability to retain some players that they might otherwise not thought about keeping, given the cap spike that everybody now
And that's
gets.
a great point. And then you get into philosophy too. And I don't know what Mike Bergonzi's philosophy is. I don't know what McKenzie's philosophy is. Chad Brinker's philosophy. These are all guys who've been in the league for a while. Do you want to start? Because there'll be guys who are cut who are good players. That's always the way it is.
Sure.
And then these are guys um, who sometimes guys are cut who are good players. They're a little older, and you're not necessarily interested in signing them to 3 or 4 year deals. Maybe they become 1 year deal guys. I mean, look what the Eagles did with someone like Zach Bond, who's a 1 year guy, and now they
Yeah.
have to figure out. I'm sure they'd love to sign him long term. We'll see how that plays out. The question is, do you want to start bringing in some 1 year type guys, or are you thinking, hey, this is going to be a little bit of a process, and we don't necessarily want to bring in a 30-year-old veteran for 1 year?
Yeah.
That gets into a philosophy. I certainly don't know their philosophy. I'm sure you don't. They probably haven't come out and stated it publicly. They don't need to. But do you want here? Like, I'll throw out a name that could well be cut, like a Joey Bosa.
Hmm.
He's gets hurt a lot, but when he plays, he's obviously a very good player. The Chargers need cap relief. They could easily cut a guy like Joey Bosa. You know, he's probably not a guy you're looking to sign 4 years for a ton of money. Are you interested in signing a guy like that for 1 year, for whatever the number is? You have to decide that as an organization.
Yeah, and certainly just for the reference of the audience, I mean, they have kind of, and this is, I think, the case for every team, but the closest thing that we've gotten them to sharing on their philosophical front here locally is, draft, develop, retain is the thing that they are most trying to correct or kind of shift because obviously
Right.
that's not been the case here, Greg. I mean, John Robinson had a good run of drafts for a period of time, but then the retention was not something that was obviously a part of that. The only first round pick that John had that made it to a second contract is Jeff Simmons, and John didn't even do that extension because that was after the team had moved on from him. And
Right.
in
And
the
again,
absence of that, they've been trying to plug a lot of pieces and parts in free agency, which you and I talked about a great deal last year, and those results vary from team to team.
well, based on what you said, then, I mean, again, you never know because you don't know who's going to be available in free agency, and maybe there's two or three guys you go, oh my God, we'd love to get that guy. You don't
Right.
know. Um, but if you go with that approach, which there's nothing wrong with that approach, by the way, there's no right or wrong answer on approach. But if you want to do draft, develop, retain, then you're not thinking necessarily in terms of stopgap 1 year guys,
Yeah. I
you know.
think the term that has been thrown around by them in our limited exposure to them under the new administration so far is a selective approach to free agency. So
Right.
something for Titans fans to keep in
Well,
mind as we approach this.
and again, that gets back to what you do then with the draft. I mean, unless there's someone you absolutely look, we know the names, the Travis Hunters, the Abdul Carters. Who knows about the quarterback situation? Um, I personally think Cam Ward is worthy of a number one pick, but that may be me. Um, but if they don't see that, and they may not, then do you want to just start? If someone makes a great offer, do you want to take that because you can start accumulating players?
Mm.
And this is a team we know they probably feel they need a quarterback, but they also need a lot of players.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to our more in-depth prospect breakdowns. Today's just kind of like a general theme
Oh,
discussion as far
sure,
as what we're
sure.
looking for
Yeah,
the
we'll get
combine.
into
But the
we'll get
Cam
into
Ward
all that.
thing is going to be a big talking point here because I do think that I mean, they haven't met with him yet, right? Like this is such a huge part of the process. They haven't
Oh,
had the
without question.
opportunity as a team to talk to the player. They can do some due diligence around the player, but that's, a big part of combine, and then we'll get into pro days, 30 visits, and on down the line. So
Right, right.
certainly
No, no,
no rush
they're not
as
there
far as
yet.
that goes.
Right, yeah, right now they're just getting the info from all their scouts, but they haven't, you have to talk to the players. You got to get to know the players. You got to talk to them. And they'll have a plan. I mean, look, Borgonzi was with the Chiefs for 16 years, if I'm not mistaken. McKenzie's been in the league forever.
Right.
They're going to have a plan. It's you have to. And these guys are veterans. These guys
Yeah.
are veterans.
Absolutely. And that's something that the Titans fans, I think, are excited about in principle. We'll see how it all plays out. So, combine, obviously, the next step for everybody in the league. And Greg, there's so many different fascinating components of this offseason, whether you're talking about Cincinnati, Tennessee, Kansas City, Philadelphia, all these different teams and all their varying situations. But heading into this combine week, what are some of the biggest questions that you are looking to have answered on your side of things?
Well, it's a different kind of combine because I think that the big positions, Buck, are not positions we normally spend a lot of time talking about. I mean, defensive tackle might be as good as we've seen in years and years and years. And I mean, I spoke to someone who thinks that there could be 20 defensive tackles taken in the first 3 rounds, which is absurd. Um,
Crazy. 20?
Yeah, and I've done a bunch of them. I've got many more to do. As miles to go before I sleep, as is the case. But uh, I mean, these guys are. There's a lot of good prospects at D tackle, a lot of good ones, and there's some guys who, again, without knowing the player, that could be superstars. I think running back. We mentioned that just as far as the run game. Again, we know what Ashton Genty is. He'll be a top 10 pick. After that, there'll be a lot of guys. They may not be first rounders, but there's a lot of really good backs in this draft that are going to play in the league and be, valuable players for teams. Um, I think O-line, another position that isn't necessarily a sexy position, Buck, but I mean, look at the Eagles, okay? And
Yeah.
then look how they ate up the Chiefs, who really had a hard time with their O-line, and had to make a bunch of changes, and they just got eaten up. I mean, it's hard. Hey, the Titans fans, they know as well as any fan base in the league about if your O-line can't play, what that does to your offense.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, just certainly, Greg, you talk about the sexiness of varying conversations. No fan base is as obsessed with offensive line discourse as
Yeah.
this one has been over three
I mean,
seasons
you
now.
can't. I remember years ago when I did the book with Ron Jaworski, which was 12 or 13 years ago, and I was the one who did all the interviews. I've talked to 100 coaches, players, former players. And one of the things that I've never forgotten is when I talked to John Gruden, and one of the first things he said was, "You don't have an offense without your O-line, and you
Yeah.
don't have a pass game without protection." I mean, it's as simple as I mean, it's obviously there's a lot of detail. We know that, but that's the bottom line. If your O-line is not good, it's hard to run offense.
You never know what you're going to get on this podcast. You get a little Robert Frost mixed in with some offensive line
There you go.
evaluation, and this is why we enjoy
Well, I love the
sharing
fact that
Greg
you knew
with the
that it was
audience.
Robert Frost. I love the fact that you knew it was Robert Frost.
Well, there's even a redneck like me, Greg, will occasionally get the odd poetry reference, but
Well, the library at Amherst College was the Robert Frost Library, so that was the name of the
so that
library.
better have been drilled in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's etched into my brain, even though I was there in the mid 70s, that's when I went to college. But yeah.
No
Mm.
question. Looking, kind of going back to your point about the interior defensive line class, that's going to be an interesting kind of to see how teams go about it. To your point about potentially, as many as 20 players in the first 3 rounds or something, and we'll see how it actually plays out. But that skill set, take a guy like Mason Graham, for example, who, I
Yep.
mean, many people could consider the safest player in the first round, given what it is that he does, what it is that he shows on tape, and everything that the league values right now from that position. I'm just so fascinated to see, and obviously all of these defensive tackles are not built the same. They're not all interior pass rushers.
No, and I'm
Some
glad you
have
said that.
developmental traits. These things are going to help inform, though, how teams go about the draft process
And I'm
based on
glad you
what these
mentioned that
players
that they're
show.
not the same, Buck, because to me, and it's funny, I had a conversation with a scout last night, and we agreed that the most physically gifted D tackle in this draft is Walter Nolan.
Hmm.
Now I've heard he's got character issues. I don't go there because I'm just sitting watching tape. So
Sure.
we'll leave that aside for the moment. But Nolan and Graham, even though they theoretically play the same position, they're totally different players. Totally different players.
Yeah.
So, you never know, you're going to see a lot of different shapes, sizes, body types. Um, some guys can play one position on the D line. Some guys can play every D tackle position along the entire front. You don't know.
Well, we're going to know a little more. Well, we'll know a great deal more after this coming week in Indianapolis, Greg. And I know you're going to be able to jump on with me live. We're going to have a bunch of great guests at the combine to help prepare us for the upcoming process. Obviously, the Titans have a huge role to play in this year's draft, given that they currently hold
Huge role.
the
Huge
number
role.
one overall pick. And we're going to have a bunch of stuff to talk about come the live show on May the 2nd at the Analog. The tickets are selling fast, buddy. We announced that what, a week? A little
A
more than a
week.
week ago, and 50 people have already bought tickets. The VIP tickets are selling the fastest.
Oh, that's awesome. I can't, I got my plane reservations, Buck. I'm all set. I'm ready to rock and roll. Can't wait to get down there.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting time at the Hutton Hotel in the Analog Room. If you don't know what we're talking about, it's the third annual Install Live Show with Greg and me, and potentially we'll be able to tell you some more things that we've got planned here in the coming weeks in the lead up. But we want to give people the opportunity to get tickets before they sell out, because last year, Greg, we sold out with like a month to go.
No, let's
1045thezone.com is where you go to get those tickets. Greg and I couldn't be more excited about the show that we're putting together. And, always an exciting offseason around here. The season, they could start to pick up a little traction, but this is, of course, a critical
No,
part.
this is going to be fun. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we'll look forward to seeing Greg at the Combine next week and all of you on May the 2nd at the Install Live. Thank you as always, buddy.
Thanks, Buck. Appreciate it.